Insane. I'm going to start my sermon today by clearing my throat. Then after that, I'm going to start my sermon by doing something scandalous. I'm not going to read from the Bible today. Yes, I know we have lots of ordained ministers and almost ministers in our congregation. Our prayer today was offered by a seminary professor, for Pete's sake. Hang on to your hats. I'm not going to read the Bible. I'm just going to tell you the story. Full disclosure, my shorter version is going to leave out a lot. It's not intended to be inclusive of the entire text, which is a story from Mark's gospel. I'm just going to tell you the parts that I want to talk about. We continue today in the Gospel of Mark, where we've been hanging out for the past few weeks. Jesus has been telling stories about seeds and sleeping on his comfy cushion in the boat, even during the storm, and then waking up and calming the sea, all in a day's work. Today, Jesus is out of the boat. A crowd is following him. A leader from the synagogue, Jairus, comes up to Jesus. He throws himself at Jesus' feet and he says, "My daughter is about to die. Come heal her." And Jesus says, "Okay." And then off he goes. The crowd follows him. Now, in the crowd, there's a woman. No name is given for this woman. What we do know is that she's suffering from something like a uterine hemorrhage. She's been bleeding for 12 years. Even though she spent all of her money on doctors, she just keeps getting worse. She hears about Jesus and she thinks, well, what have I got to lose? My imagination filled in that part. She thinks, maybe if I just reach out to touch his clothes as he passes by, it'll be enough. It's worth a try, at least. So she does. And in Mark's imagination, as soon as she touches Jesus' cloak, immediately she is healed. It's interesting. Jairus comes right up to Jesus with his request, power and privilege from a man with a name there. The woman with no name sneaks up behind Jesus and just reaches for the hem of his robe. But it works out for her. True. Jesus stops and he says, "Wait a minute, who touched me?" The disciples say, "How do we know? Look at all these people." It starts to get intense. Everybody gets quiet. So the woman sort of raises her hand. Again, my imagination, did people raise hands in those days? I have no idea. She says, "It was me. I touched you." And Jesus says, "Well, you made yourself well. Way to go." All the time, Jairus is like, come on, my daughter, remember? And somebody says, "Oh, sorry, your daughter didn't make it." And Jesus says, "Let's just see about that." Long story short, when they get to her, sure enough, she seems dead, but Jesus takes her hand, and she gets up and starts walking around. Incredible. All in a day's work. Interesting symmetry. Mark notes that the girl is 12 years old, and the woman had bled for 12 years. The girl, around puberty perhaps, is compared to the woman who has this excess of vaginal bleeding. Both bleed, both lack power, both are saved. Could the story serve to foreshadow Jesus? After all, he will bleed, he will lack power, he will be raised. The Gospels are full of stories about Jesus healing. The healing stories are moving and powerful. In the earliest days of the Christian faith, the healing stories were very important in convincing the world of Jesus' stature as the Christian faith began to build. Plus, the healing stories, I'm going to take a drink. Plus, the healing stories have inspired healers, ever since. Progressive Christians sometimes don't quite know what to do with these healing stories. The concept of faith healing is contrary to things in which we place a lot of stock, things like science and reason. When we are sick, we generally put ourselves in the hands of doctors and pharmacists. And most of us have mostly good experience with the medical model of healing. We take whatever pills we're told to take and see the doctor in the morning. Most of the time we feel better, eventually. Or we accept surgery, and we see a lot of doctors on a lot of mornings, and most of the time we feel better, eventually. We're also aware of diseases that don't go away, even with diagnosis and medication and treatment, injuries that don't get better, illness that cannot be cured. Whether it is cancer or Alzheimer's, or schizophrenia, depression, COVID, or long-haul COVID, we're aware of the limits of medicine. For some of us, disease takes over and there's little hope for a cure. And of course, there's one condition that we are absolutely sure will never be cured, and that is life itself. Because we are mortal. Death is inevitable. Medicine may win a lot of battles, but it will always lose the war. What then does it mean for progressive people to talk of healing in a religious context? Illness and disease are understood more clearly than ever before, and yet adequate health care for most of the world's people remains inaccessible. What does it mean to talk of healing when all too often the best we can do with all of our knowledge and power and technology is not enough for many, many people who suffer? I really would like to think that a person's spiritual and emotional dimension could be made so whole and healthy that they could pull their physical self toward wholeness. Like Jesus says in so many gospel stories, your faith has made you well. Dr. Albert Schweitzer reportedly said, the role of the doctor is to awaken the physician in each person, but no one really knows how to do that. And yet there are stories of people who recover from illness or accident without explanation in the face of overwhelming odds. One person comes to my mind because she's sitting right in front of us, of course. But why this person and not that one? Why here and not there? We don't know. I am skeptical of dramatic stories of faith healing, though I'm not ready to discount the healing power of family and community support, of visualization, of prayer. Maybe there could be a physician in each person who's ready to be awakened, but we don't yet understand exactly how that works. There is likely no single path, no surefire way for that awakening to happen. The whole concept of sickness and health in the ancient Near East varied greatly from our own. Jesus knew nothing of germs and genes or viruses and variants, for that matter. Many believed in Jesus' day that infirmity could be a result of God's punishment for evil done by the person who was sick or maybe even their parents, though Jesus rejected that idea. Some scholars say that the Roman military occupation was so brutal in Jesus' day that it created mass psychosis, mental disorders with physical symptoms like hysterical blindness, lameness. If so, then perhaps Jesus was healing wounded minds and spirits. Even the concept of health itself meant something different to Jesus' contemporaries. Health was a state of complete well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Health did not require the absence of disease or infirmity. Ancient Mediterranean culture emphasized being rather than achieving or doing. You had health if you could live with a sense of wholeness and connection and meaning in your life. It's so different from our capitalistic culture. We do not claim to be healed as long as there's some injury or disease that prevents us from going back to work or being a productive member of society. But the mark of Jesus' healing people was about restoring relationships, not about their level of productivity. Being healed then was different from being cured. People Jesus healed, like women, lepers, the demon-possessed, these were people who had been often relegated to the outskirts of town. They were healed. The mark of healing came when they could leave the graveyards and caves they'd been exiled to and return to their place in community, their relatedness in their families. Maybe Jesus' healings were more communal than medical. Being healed is when people were restored to community, when they find meaning in life, whether they are cured of a disease or not. If healing is about connection, purpose, wholeness, fullness of life, then it's possible for all of us to be healed, no matter what ails us. And it's not only Jesus who can do it. We all can. Indeed, there is no more important work that we can do. Most of us are not able to cure somebody, but we can still be healers. Healing happens every time we open our hearts to include and welcome.